There is a certain kind of emotional pain that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't break into noise or chaos. It lingers in silence. It sits with you in front of your phone while you reread messages that never fully landed, trying to interpret tone shifts that were never explained. It replays conversations in fragments, searching for something solid to hold on to in words that suddenly went cold or unfinished. One moment, there was closeness. There was softness, presence, a sense of mutual space, even if not fully open, still emotionally reachable. And then, almost without warning, it feels like a door quietly shut somewhere between you. Not just distance, but disconnection. As if the emotional world you were sharing was pulled away and you were left standing in it alone, aware of your own heartbeat more than anything else. If you've ever been emotionally involved with someone who leans avoidant, this experience is familiar. It isn't simple rejection, it's disorientation. It's the kind of emotional whiplash that comes from being close enough to feel connection, but not stable enough to trust it. Moments of warmth create belief, and then the withdrawal that follows makes you question everything that just felt real. And if you're someone with a highly sensitive or deeply empathetic nature, this dynamic hits differently. You don't move away when someone pulls back. You lean in. You try to understand. You search for meaning in their distance instead of accepting it at face value. You start building explanations that protect the bond in your mind. Maybe they're overwhelmed. Maybe they've been hurt before. Maybe if you show enough patience, enough softness, enough emotional intelligence, they will eventually feel safe enough to stay consistent. So you adjust yourself, you soften your needs, you stretch your understanding, you wait. But there is a difficult reality underneath that pattern. When empathy has no boundaries, it can unintentionally become part of the cycle that keeps emotional distance in place. The more you explain, the more you accommodate, the more you stay emotionally available through their withdrawal, the less they are forced to confront what their absence actually costs. You become a constant emotional presence even in your own absence, a backup connection, a cushion, something they can return to without having to fully face what disconnecting from you means. And over time, this creates a loop where they can step back without real consequence, because the emotional bridge is always quietly rebuilt from your side. This is why the cycle repeats, not because feelings don't exist, but because the structure allows it. What makes this pattern so powerful is that both people are reacting from nervous system survival strategies rather than conscious intention. For one person, closeness begins to feel like pressure or emotional demand. For the other, distance begins to feel like threat or abandonment. So when intimacy increases, one pulls back to regain internal regulation, and when that withdrawal is felt, the other moves forward to restore connection. From the outside, it looks like inconsistency, but internally, it is regulation. Both systems are trying to feel safe. They are just moving in opposite directions. This is also why the connection can feel so intense and consuming. It doesn't behave like stable attachment. It behaves like activation. The uncertainty keeps the emotional system alert, scanning, hoping, reacting. The brain begins to bond not just with the person, but with the pattern itself. Intermittent connection strengthens fixation. Moments of return feel powerful precisely because of the absence that preceded them. And slowly, emotional focus shifts from genuine connection to anticipation. Waiting becomes part of attachment. In many avoidant-leaning individuals, emotional closeness doesn't just create comfort. It can also trigger internal alarm. Deep intimacy activates fear responses tied to autonomy, control, or emotional overwhelm. It is not necessarily that love feels unsafe, but that intensity can feel internally destabilizing. As emotional depth increases, their system may interpret it as pressure rather than connection. The body responds before conscious thought can fully form it. Tension rises. Emotional energy becomes too much to process. The mind starts searching for relief through distance, distraction, or withdrawal. And even they may not fully understand why their feelings suddenly shift into numbness, irritation, or uncertainty. Meanwhile, the more attuned partner often senses this shift before anything is spoken. They notice the delay in replies, the reduced warmth, the subtle changes in tone. Their awareness becomes hyper-refined. They begin reading small signals as emotional indicators. This is where attachment becomes chemically reinforced. Uncertainty activates reward pathways. Small moments of attention feel disproportionately relieving. Emotional regulation starts depending on external responses rather than internal stability. The connection becomes something you monitor, not just experience. And this is where misunderstanding often deepens, because withdrawal is not always lack of feeling. In many cases, it is feeling becoming too intense to stay present with. But when that withdrawal is interpreted as proof of worthlessness, the sensitive partner begins to turn inward against themselves. They try to become easier to love, less intense, less expressive, less emotionally demanding. They start shrinking their emotional truth in an attempt to maintain connection. But reducing yourself does not create secure attachment. It only creates imbalance. It teaches the other person that connection will adjust itself around their discomfort, rather than requiring mutual emotional participation. Over time, this leads to a distortion where inconsistency gets normalized. Silence gets explained away, emotional absence gets reframed, and exhaustion gets mislabeled as patience or devotion. At some point, empathy stops being connection and starts becoming self-neglect disguised as understanding. This is where a shift becomes necessary, not through emotional punishment or strategic withdrawal, but through clarity, through stopping the constant interruption of silence with explanation, because silence, real, grounded silence, reveals structure. Not silence used to provoke or manipulate, but silence that comes from not overextending yourself anymore. When you stop chasing clarification, stop filling emotional gaps, stop managing someone else's internal state, something changes. The dynamic is no longer constantly being softened from your side. And for someone who has been receiving emotional access without consistent responsibility, that absence becomes noticeable in a different way, not through words, but through space. At first, that space can feel uncomfortable for the one who has been overgiving. The urge to re-engage, to repair, to reconnect can feel strong. But often, what feels like the need for closure is actually discomfort with not being emotionally chosen in real time. When that impulse is not immediately acted on, a different awareness begins to form. The emotional system that was previously buffered by constant access to you now has to sit with your absence without interpretation or repair. And in that space, reality becomes clearer, not through what you say, but through what you no longer carry for them. Avoidance is often misunderstood in one key way. It is rarely just about escaping arguments, emotional intensity, or difficult conversations. What is far more unsettling for many avoidant-leaning individuals is something quieter and more internal. The emptiness that follows when the person who once provided emotional safety, softness, and unconditional understanding is no longer consistently accessible. Because even when it looks like they have detached, the attachment itself doesn't simply vanish. It gets suppressed, compartmentalized, pushed below awareness. It is minimized, rationalized, distracted away from. But emotional bonds don't dissolve just because they are buried. They remain stored in the nervous system, waiting for moments of quiet to surface again. And silence has a way of doing exactly that. When external emotional pressure is gone, when there is no longer a consistent presence of warmth, patience, or understanding to lean on, the mind begins to replay what once was, not in a dramatic or immediate way, but in fragments. Memory returns through sensations rather than logic, a tone of voice, a familiar moment, the way you made things feel safe without demanding perfection in return, the emotional space you held without making it conditional. Slowly, what was once taken for granted becomes something noticeably absent, and that absence can feel surprisingly loud. In that space, avoidant patterns don't always stay in avoidance. What can emerge instead is a form of delayed emotional processing, not always healthy, not always conscious, but real nonetheless. The system that once distanced itself to maintain control now has to confront the emotional imprint of what was left behind. That is often when reemergence happens, not always in direct or emotionally mature ways. Sometimes it shows up as a casual message, a late-night check-in, a reaction to something small, or a vague attempt to reconnect that is dressed in neutrality. It may even come with a sense of nostalgia that is difficult for them to explain. But beneath it, something is shifting. Because when consistent emotional access is removed, the nervous system no longer has the same buffer against longing. The presence that was once easy to retreat from becomes something that is now missed in its absence. And what used to feel like pressure can, over time, begin to feel like loss. This is where many highly empathic individuals misunderstand their own role in the dynamic. They assume their impact is defined only by how much they give. But in reality, what lingers is not just the effort, but the emotional experience they create in another person's nervous system. The feeling of being seen without being judged. The sense of being understood without having to perform emotional perfection. The rare experience of safety without pressure. That imprint does not disappear quickly. Avoidant individuals may distract themselves, enter new dynamics, or convince themselves they are unaffected. Yet there are often moments where what was suppressed resurfaces in quiet ways, not necessarily as clarity, but as emotional residue that they struggle to fully categorize. However, this is also where distortion can begin for the empathic partner, because a return, an emotional reach, or a moment of longing does not automatically signal change. It does not guarantee growth, accountability, or capacity for sustained intimacy. Missing someone is not the same thing as being able to stay with them in closeness. This distinction is where many cycles repeat. Without real emotional development, the same pattern can easily restart. Initial warmth returns, chemistry reactivates, hope rebuilds, and the nervous system interprets reconnection as resolution. But unresolved attachment dynamics do not become secure just because contact resumes. They simply become active again. So what matters is not whether someone comes back, but how they behave when they do. Do they remain present when emotional depth increases, or do they withdraw again when things require consistency? Do they communicate through discomfort or disappear into silence? Do they engage with your emotional reality or only seek access to your comfort? There is a clear difference between seeking connection and seeking relief, and understanding that difference is often where the empathic pattern begins to shift. Because one of the deepest realizations for a highly empathic person is that intensity from someone else is not the same as emotional safety. Strong feelings, longing, or nostalgia do not automatically translate into reliability or emotional readiness. Someone can feel deeply and still be unable to love consistently. That is not necessarily about cruelty, it is about capacity. And when you begin to recognize that, something important changes internally. You stop interpreting emotional activation as proof of destiny. You stop equating being missed with being chosen. You stop confusing emotional impact with relational stability. Instead, your focus begins to shift inward. The real transformation happens when your sense of worth is no longer dependent on someone else's return, when your emotional state is no longer shaped by whether or not they reappear, when your identity is no longer organized around waiting, decoding, or hoping. At that point, something subtle but powerful occurs. The internal urgency begins to dissolve. The need to explain yourself repeatedly starts to fade. The compulsion to chase emotional clarity from someone inconsistent weakens. Your nervous system stops revolving around unpredictability, and from that place, your presence changes. You become more grounded, less reactive, more internally anchored. You still care, but you are no longer emotionally unregulated by distance. You no longer overextend yourself to maintain connection that is not being reciprocated with consistency. And this shift naturally alters the dynamic. Because the version of you that was available for confusion, inconsistency, and emotional limbo is no longer leading your choices. What remains is clarity, boundaries, emotional self-respect. You are no longer trying to earn stability through patience alone. You are no longer reshaping yourself to fit into someone else's emotional limits. You are no longer abandoning your needs in order to maintain proximity. Instead, you begin to embody a quieter form of strength, one that does not rely on proving anything, one that does not depend on being chosen to feel whole, one that does not negotiate away emotional truth for the sake of attachment. From this state, relationships are no longer built on chasing or interpreting silence. They are evaluated through consistency, presence, and mutual emotional responsibility. And if someone returns into that space, they are no longer meeting the same version of you they left behind. They are meeting someone who no longer confuses attention with commitment, someone who no longer mistakes emotional intensity for emotional safety, someone who can feel deeply without disappearing into it. At that point, the dynamic cannot function the way it once did, because you are no longer available for cycles that rely on your self-abandonment to continue. And that is the quiet breaking point of the pattern. Not anger, not revenge, not withdrawal as strategy, but clarity. A state where your emotional world is no longer organized around someone else's inconsistency. And in that clarity, you stop being emotionally reachable in the old way. Not because you have hardened, but because you have returned to yourself. And once that happens, the cycle doesn't just weaken, it loses its grip entirely. In the end, the real shift is not about whether they return or stay gone. It is about you no longer losing yourself in the waiting, the decoding, or the emotional uncertainty. Avoidant patterns may come and go. People may reach out or withdraw, but none of that defines your value or your direction anymore. What matters is whether a connection is consistent, emotionally present, and able to hold you without confusion. The moment you stop abandoning yourself to keep someone close, the entire dynamic changes. You are no longer shaped by inconsistency, but anchored in clarity. And from that place, love is no longer something you chase or decode. It becomes something that either meets you fully or simply does not get access to you at all.